Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our webinar featuring experts from RGP Healthcare and lease accounting experts from LeaseAccelerator, focused on leasing as a managed service for healthcare. I now would like to introduce the speakers for today's session. We have Tim Tickle, Vice President of Healthcare with RGP, and Dennis Carey, Senior Director Solution Consulting with LeaseAccelerator. Dennis, can you share just a minute or so about your background?
Sure. Thanks, Joni, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name's Dennis Carey. I'm Senior Director of Solution Consulting at LeaseAccelerator. So my job is to work during the sales process, really wearing two hats, both the subject matter expert, so understanding the accounting standards, as well as the technical expert, being able to explain the LeaseAccelerator software and how it can help manage and account for your leases. I've been in the software business about 5 to 6 years now between LeaseAccelerator and a treasury management software company. And before that, I'd been over 20 years in corporate finance, corporate accounting, and treasuries, holding different roles. I was 13 years at Hasbro, the large toy and game company, and I was assistant treasurer for a number of years before I left there and moved into the software space.
Thank you, Dennis. And Tim, could you describe your background, please?
Sure. Thanks, Joni. Again, my name is Tim Tickle, and I'm a vice president within the advisory practice specializing in healthcare at RGP. My background, CPA by trade, spent about 15 years in public accounting, then made the shift to the other side of the table and worked as a corporate executive for a Fortune 100 company for about 15 years, doing mainly special projects, shared services, and transformation. And recently with RGP, I joined in 2016 as a member of their national practice focused heavily on the lease accounting standards, both ASC 842, IFRS 16, and GASB 87, and have led a number of the engagements globally within that space.
Thank you, Tim. So let's move on to the agenda. So we're going to talk about what is a managed service and how does RGP leverage LeaseAccelerator to provide the service? What are the benefits of using managed lease accounting services? What can private companies learn from the challenges faced by public companies? What unique challenges are found in leasing for healthcare organizations, and how can RGP help? Why managed services will play a greater role as organizations move forward, and who should be included in the analysis of a leasing solution? So we're going to start with our first agenda item, and I'm going to turn this over to Dennis.
Sure. Thanks, Joni. Yes, so to think about a managed service, first, let's not even think about it from a business standpoint. Think about it in your own life. Unless you live in a location that has access to a stream or to a constant source of wind, or you have 300-plus sunny days a year, you probably aren't generating your own electricity. You theoretically could do this yourself, but most likely you use a service for this that can do it more efficiently and cheaply. Your electric company is a managed service. You can also see examples of managed service providers using a managed service. For instance, a store credit card. That store most likely uses a bank to manage the credit card service. Now think of the bank. They most likely use a managed service for customer support. So managed services are everywhere in our own lives as well as in our business life. Now, for the business side of it, the term managed service really came about it started out from IT, help desks, and network and server management. They were the first ones to really use the term managed service, but you think about it, and it's been around longer than that. You theoretically could move products from one location to another within your organization, from one state to another, but you also have managed service providers like UPS, FedEx, DHL, et cetera, that can do that. The first managed service from a finance area that really started to happen was obviously in the payroll area. And again, you could theoretically have this expertise in-house, knowing the requirements around payroll tax and the like in all of the states that you operate in, but it might be just as easy to use someone else that has that kind of expertise to do the job for you. So again, it comes down to expertise and resources as well as the cost. So for expertise, again, do you have the ability to do this yourself, or can someone else do it better and easier than you can? we're really seeing a trend in this where more organizations start to look at more things and think about, is this a critical function for my people to do? Now, obviously, payroll is a critical function. But again, is it a critical function for a payroll department in-house, or is it a critical function that a payroll department can oversee and manage the process that is happening somewhere else? So the real key here is the expertise. Do you have it in your house? Do you have it in-house? Or is there someone else that can do it better and have that expertise? Do you have the resources, both in terms of time and money, and the cost? Avoiding having to hire ancillary people to do this work may be something that is better managed with the scale and expertise of a provider. So, Tim, before you move on to the next slide, any thoughts on these items?
No, I think you hit it on the nail on the head there, Dennis. I think for most businesses, it's really determining whether or not they want to make that investment. There are critical investments for many businesses to make. Is this an area where they want to invest in, software, resources, the infrastructure, everything around that in order to manage that new platform? Those are things that have to be kind of borne out through a real pro and con analysis to determine whether or not it's really critical to your business. So I think, what we're seeing is that more companies are looking at this as more of an ancillary function as opposed to a core function of accounting. And thus far, that's what's kind of born this new market of managed services for lease accounting. So if I wanted to take a second quickly to kind of go forward on this, how are we doing it at RGP and how have we addressed it? So, on the far left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see what has traditionally been our standard or traditional methodology for delivering the adoption of the new accounting standard as well as sustained compliance. And that's usually a very upfront, intensive project where you're leveraging expertise to, identify leases, do a cleansing of those leases, identifying a software platform, configuring a platform, gathering all the data, abstracting all the data, doing all of the testing of the platform, and then ultimately standing up the platform, and then ultimately turning that over to the client. And then ongoing administration becomes a function of the internal resources of the client. That, as I said, is the traditional model. What we've been seeing is that we've got a number of clients that have been asking us to be a little bit more flexible in this, and that kind of gets us into that middle, what we would consider to be hybrid solutions, where yes, the client is actually investing in the software and doing a lot of the due diligence up front for adopting the standard, but they do not want to invest in the resources and the expertise necessary to administer their program going forward. And so we have a number of clients where our back office actually serves as the lease administrator for the client's system. So in this case, the client has implemented a software and it resides within the client domain. But we at RGP actually have access, and we actually do the administration on a month-to-month basis of the client's software. As a natural progression to that, we ultimately get to the far right, which is that pure outsource model, where, again, the client doesn't want to necessarily make any investments in software, no investments in long-term subscription fees, resources, the headache that comes with, turnover, et cetera. And they basically hire a managed service to provide that. And so our service offering actually includes the ability for us to basically deploy on our software systems, and these are systems that you all are looking at and or have already looked at, and we deploy your leasing on our system and configure that to your corporate expectation. We are then, from that perspective, then in charge of administering that database, and that means providing all of the monthly journal entries, providing all of the reporting associated with month-end, as well as year-end reporting. We also bucket on top of that the ability for any new leases to be data abstracted and loaded into the system. So essentially what the client is essentially doing at this point is basically gathering information and forwarding it to us. and we are actually performing all of the back-end lease accounting. And that provides a number of benefits to the client in such that, they're not making these huge upfront commitments. They are in either software or in resources. And it gives them a much more palatable monthly budgeted amount that they can, plan for, especially in these times of unexpected, pandemics that we're dealing with. So this lease accounting basically as a service has been brought about as kind of the market has dictated more flexible solutions and the fact that there is less capital for a lot of these organizations to actually, deploy a traditional model. So with that, I will turn it back to Joni for our first poll question.
Okay, thank you. Does your organization currently use managed services for payroll only for multiple functions? C, we don't use managed services, or D, not sure if we use managed services?
I certainly see a lot of people that will say for payroll only. We know there's large payroll providers that a lot of organizations use. When it gets into the multiple functions, it almost gets back to how I use the broad description of managed services, which is someone else doing something for you that you could do yourself. So really, anyone could say if we use UPS or FedEx, we are using a managed service. So it's certainly possible to answer that way. So I think definitely what we've seen in the industry is obviously a lot of people use it for payroll, but it is expanding. We are starting to see managed services from things that didn't have that capability before, and it's really as the companies like RGP built the expertise in-house to be able to manage these functions for organizations, a lot more people take advantage of it. And for those of you, if the poll question closed too quickly, we will have 3 more poll questions. Just make sure to answer all 3 of them, and you'll still meet your CPE requirement.
Yeah, and Dennis, I would also highlight one that probably many in healthcare are aware of, and that would be our GPOs, those that are doing global purchasing for us. Those are that's a managed service, and so very prevalent within the healthcare space. That's a good example of another area where you're probably leveraging the expertise of another company to actually do a very critical component of your business.
Okay, thank you. So for the next item on the agenda, what are the benefits of using managed lease accounting services? And I'm going to turn this over to Tim to start.
Well, as I kind of alluded to in our previous one, I think that when we bucket it down to 3 main areas: costs, resources, and expertise. So from a cost perspective, you're not going to have a significant year 1 cost associated with the purchase of a software and the ultimate deployment of that software, and then additionally over time you'll have relief from the subscription fees that are typically associated with a SaaS-based product. From a resources perspective, you will no longer be required to build out that internal administration function within your organization. You may still want to have somebody that is managing the relationship with the managed service provider, but as far as having arms and legs to actually review contracts, abstract data, load data, run reports, run journal entries, etc., that is no longer a necessary resource. And so for organizations that are resource constrained due to either economics or COVID right now, again, that's a very viable option to you. And then lastly is expertise. Now, I don't know too many organizations that have that aren't in the leasing business that have in-house expertise as it relates to lease accounting. And so what you gather from the managed service perspective is you are getting to purchase not only the services but also the expertise of the managed service provider in the fact that they have done this over and over again. They have access to best practices. They have access to similar contracts, et cetera. And therefore, that investment in the expertise is no longer needed. So again, from a benefits perspective, I would button it down to, cost, resources, and expertise, kind of as Dennis alluded to earlier. Now, when we think about, what's happening in the market over the next year that is even going to complicate things even more, 2021 is kind of slated to be what I consider to be a flooded year as it relates to leases. We've got multiple accounting standards that are going live that will impact or ultimately will flood the market with companies and organizations needing accounting software solutions for leases. First, you'll have the public or the private entities. All of the people that are non-public will now be looking for software solutions to manage under ASC 842. You also have all of the not-for-profit healthcare organizations that had received a year deferment from reporting under the new standard. They will now be, again, looking for software solutions. And then one that probably you hadn't been aware of, but all of the government entities, that being state, local governments, or universities, or even healthcare that has to follow GASB accounting standards. There is the new GASB 87 that actually is hitting next year also. So as you can imagine, there is going to be a significant amount of demand for software and services, and there's going to be a limited amount of supply. Now, from a managed service perspective, this gives you the access without the headache. Again, the softwares are already deployed. Your upfront time that it takes to actually get to contract is shrunk down significantly, and you're not necessarily at the whim of the software provider to get around to being able to show you a demo and or schedule your implementation. So you do have some ability to mitigate a lot of the risks that come with the actual deployment of a software on your own next year, as most likely you will find that most of those systems will be coming with a premium price tag just due to the demand next year. What does that look like, in comparison? Using the old COVID term of flattening the curve, on the top line, you see the traditional model, which is rather steep in year one, where we're typically incurring a significant amount of costs related to the implementation and configuration of the software. And then it continues to grow from there as it relates to the subscription agreements. And at the very bottom, you see the lease accounting as a service. It's a very manageable curve. It does not have a significant year one cost, and it is budgetable over the period of the contract. It does not significantly fluctuate. So it's a little bit more budget friendly to those that are, running on tighter budgets. And the actual ability to get up and moving is much more efficient than it is trying to manage your own deployment, as well as building out the infrastructure internally to support that. Dennis, do you have any comments as it relates to just the benefits of managed services or what we could potentially see in the market in the next year?
Yeah, I certainly think one point that really needs to be emphasized is what you were talking about on the prior slide. Just with that, the just sheer number of organizations that are going to be looking to do something. We lived through 2018 when public companies had to comply with ASC 842. And in the U.S., there's somewhere around 5,500 public companies that are of sufficient size to expect that they're going to want to use software to accomplish that. When you talk about not only private companies, we're not only looking at ASC 842, we're also at the same time looking at GASB 87. There are hundreds of thousands of organizations that are of sufficient size that might need to do something. So it's really two things. Get out in front of it, and if you can avoid having to go through looking at several softwares, doing the evaluations, doing the demos, putting your project team together, spending the time to do that, and instead you're simply looking at, can a managed service provider give me the information I need? It could possibly make your project that much quicker and easier when you're looking at so many others that are going to be going through the same thing.
Okay, so here's our second polling question out of 4 again. Do you believe you have sufficient staff and internal expertise to perform lease management and accounting under the new standards? Okay, so Tim, do you have thoughts on this?
Well, I think that, just depending on the organization, it's going to be more reflective of, personally what I've seen. Right now it's mainly due to how impactful COVID has been to the organization as to whether or not, they've maybe instituted some hiring freezes or cost reduction measures that are greatly impacting the resource availability in order to manage a project like this. And so, I think those that have the internal resources, I think that's great. But those that don't, I think those are the areas, the good news is that if you feel like you are resource constrained, or that you even if you think you might have resources, it may strain your resources too much. I would highly recommend at least, looking at managed services as a way to enable or expand your resource capability. There's nothing that says that you can't go back from a managed service offering. So if there was any, if you were to contract with a service provider to do this, you're not married for life. And if it became something that was integral to your business that you felt could come back at a later date, maybe perhaps when the economy wasn't so up in turmoil right now, that's an option that you would always have as it relates to a managed service offering. Dennis, any thoughts on your side?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to you have the resources in-house, but what are you using them for? What are the value adds that they're providing? And if it isn't managing your lease portfolio on a monthly basis, and you can have someone else do that, then you have the ability for those people to do functions that are more critical to your core requirements.
Okay.
I would add one other step there real quick, Dennis. You kind of piqued my thought here, but a lot of organizations, especially in healthcare, have pretty built out real estate organizations that are managing a lot of the real estate portfolio. And what we're talking about here is not upsetting that particular component of the business. It's purely around the accounting component. So a lot of those real estate organizations are probably really good at managing your internal real estate portfolio. But are they the right people to do the accounting? Or do you have enough people internally that know the new accounting standards sufficiently that they can apply it to the real estate portfolio or the portfolio that is being managed internally? That's the key expertise. That is, what we've seen. It's not something they teach in school, and it's something that usually comes with time. So that would be where I would consider to be where you need to focus your review of resources, would be on that accounting aspect.
Okay, so let's move to the next agenda item. What can private companies learn from the challenges faced by public companies? And Dennis, I'll let you start with this.
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. We both clicked the slide. I'll move it back. There we go. Reading this quote from a partner at a Big Four firm really is an important lesson to learn from those public companies that have been dealing with this now for over a year and a half, because a lot of them had to be effective 1/1/19. In the first sentence, the important word is still. Lease accounting is still a big challenge. They struggle with the software they selected, with the high workload, or the challenging processes to keep lease data up to date. They're not yet thinking about the benefits that could come from automation, both automation within a software platform, but also just the complete automation of a managed service provider, where you're worried about two things. What information do I have to get to them, and how do I get it to them for new leases, for changes to leases, et cetera, and what do I get back? What's the end result? What's the offering that they're giving me, the reporting, the information that they're providing me? So it's not worrying about the middle part, what's happening and how it's being done. It's worrying about what do I have to do for them so they can do what they're doing for me. And that's really the critical part to think about moving forward. And why is this so important? It's because one of the big lessons that public companies learned is leases change. You put in a new lease, And as much as 70% of your lease portfolio will undergo a change on an annual basis. Could be a rent change, it could be an amendment, it could be a modification, it could be for assets, moving them from one location to another or one cost center to another, it could be impairments. There are just a lot of things that happen over the course of leasing. So it's not just about the accounting, it's not just about the end result, it's about how you get there. So it really is thinking about the life cycle of the lease, starting on the left-hand side with strategic evaluation. So what can that mean? That could mean doing a lease versus buy analysis, having an automated process to do that. It could move up into a sourcing marketplace, having the ability to say, I want to lease this type of equipment, and having multiple vendors bid on that lease to get you better pricing. Then we move into the lease themselves. So having that central database, that central repository for all of your leasing information. So you always know, if I need information, here's where I go. That's what the managed service provider will offer for you. The accounting, complying with the standards. The managed service provider, RGP, will have the expertise and use the software that will be compliant with the standards. So you'll always know that your accounting's correct. It's the automation. It's automating your controls, as I mentioned. Have controls around what you need to provide and have controls around what you're going to get back. So the reporting and the disclosures being accurate, complete, and timely. And then end-of-term management, having a process through your managed service provider to let you know in advance. You've got a lease that's coming up to end of term and you need to notify the landlord 90 days before. Well, start getting reminders 120 days before. What do you want to do? How are we going to manage this so that you're not having leases where if it's a real estate lease, you're going to hold over and your rent is increasing, or if it's an equipment lease, you're just continuing to pay on a monthly basis even though you're past end of term. So having those controls in place actually help you save some money. And then closing it out where we started by doing evaluation at the end of the process. How is my portfolio performing? Which lessors are giving me better rates? Am I avoiding end of term? Am I avoiding holdover? So it's the entire life cycle perspective that's really important to consider. Accounting is part of it, but even more a part of it is just the managing of your lease portfolio and having a partner through automation that can help you do that. Tim, any thoughts on this before we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, Dennis, I think the one thing that stuck out on what you were saying to me was all of the different components of the organization that are involved there, going from procurement into potentially legal, into finance and accounting, and then ultimately into the financial statements. It's, within the organization, if this is something that you want to invest in and build out, you're going to have to create a very cross-functional process internally to manage this entire life cycle. Now, a lot of organizations may not choose to manage the full life cycle. Maybe they're not doing strategic sourcing, or maybe they're not doing very good end-of-term management. I think this is an opportunity for you to add that governance to your project without having to, significantly upend the way people are doing things within your organization. The managed service component will give you those aspects of it, or at least you could access those services as part of the arrangement in order to actually manage the entire life cycle, not just certain components of it.
Joni, you want to move on to our next agenda item? Thanks.
Okay. So our next area that we're going to be discussing is what unique challenges are found in leasing for healthcare organizations and how can RGP help? And I'm going to turn this over to Tim.
Thanks, Joni. I think, when we talk about what's impacting healthcare right now, what isn't impacting healthcare? I think the challenges, obviously, with the current COVID-19 has introduced a number of significant challenges to healthcare organizations, whether it be from just the ability of resources to manage the business to all the way to cash flow, and ultimately being able to actually fund the operations of the hospital. So that being said, we know that those types of challenges are are kind of operating right now. And we have to be, as service providers, we have to be flexible in how we are able to service those clients. And so, when we think about managed services, that is a direct result of some of these challenges that we're seeing within the market right now. And being able to respond to those with something that's a little bit more friendly from a cost perspective, obviously does not, for those organizations that may be on hiring freezes or even cost reduction measures, this is another way to meet the standard requirement without actually having to hire a group of people to organize it, et cetera. Additionally, what we see is, when we think about just the overall healthcare organization, we find generally that it's a very decentralized procurement organization in most cases. In some cases, you may have some centralization within a GPO, but for the most part, with these larger systems that have multiple hospitals, it's very difficult to corral the activities sufficiently enough for you to manage that internally. So by simplifying the requirement of the organizations to simply notify and or share information to a central repository for anything that might change, it's a little bit more palatable of change to implement within the organization, as opposed to trying to build a full end-to-end life cycle management process around leases, as Dennis described. And so with those challenges, there are opportunities that can be had, whether it be looking at service providers to help manage from either a cost or a resource perspective, and even more importantly, I think just the sustained compliance requirement with the standard. We can spend a lot of time, or maybe we have resources that are available now to do the processes that we have in-house, but what happens a year from now or 2 years from now? And we are not given a reprieve from having to comply with the standard going forward. So if we commit to resources now, we have to commit to resources for the long term. So I think looking at just the changing nature of the current environment, I think that there's a lot of ways to mitigate risk with that by potentially utilizing managed services. It can be used as either a short-term fix or bridge until things are somewhat back to normal, or it could be something that as an organization you've decided you just don't want to invest in, and therefore it becomes a component of your business, just like ADP for payroll or maybe Premier for a GPO. It just becomes a part of the way that you do business. Dennis, do you have any other challenges or staff changes you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really struck me when you were talking on that last slide is the advantage of having a managed service provider, because they're working across the healthcare spectrum. It's not just your staff working on your issues. It's having a managed service provider that has a wealth of knowledge that they've learned from everybody. And sometimes an issue will occur in one organization or one place that will occur at a later time somewhere else, but a managed service provider can get out in front of that because they're getting that knowledge across the industry very quickly to be able to respond and make sure that in some cases they can prevent an issue from happening somewhere else before it ever happened, because they've seen it and responded to it before. And again, just to reiterate, the reason we're talking about managed service, especially in the healthcare organization, is just looking at some of these headlines that have come across this year. I mean, everyone is dealing with this. Everyone is dealing with financial impacts. This was talking both about healthcare organizations as well as universities when we originally put the slide together, but the points are very similar. Thinking about the number of staff you have and what they're trying to do, and looking at those items across the bottom and thinking, who do I have to do these? Who has the expertise to do these? And is there someone else that can do these on my behalf, like a managed service provider? And with that, Joni, I'm going to turn it back to you. I'm going to advance to the next polling question.
Okay, great. So this is our third polling question. How has COVID-19 affected your strategy towards adopting the new lease standards? And Tim, I'd like to get was that what you expected?
Yeah, I think, at least for me, the people that I've been speaking with in the organizations I've been working with, many of them took probably about the first 6 months of the COVID crisis as, they're placing all of their projects on hold because they had no idea, whether this was going to be a short-term issue, a long-term issue, what was going to, where were they going to level out as an organization. And what we're seeing is that people are now starting to see that, this is not going away anytime soon. And there are things that have to get done regardless. And so therefore, they're starting to pick up and move these projects that they had potentially put on hold for a while. So we're seeing kind of an uptick as far as people reaching out and wanting to talk about, the new standards and the impacts that it has to their organization. And I think that has to do a lot with, people have finally leveled out where they feel like they're somewhat comfortable and they have at least an understanding of where they may be 3 months from now. I'm not going to say anything longer than that at this point, but I think maybe a 3-month window they've got a pretty decent idea about. And so with that, they're beginning to initiate some of these projects. Dennis, anything you can think of?
Yeah, no, the only thing I'd mention here is that we're obviously, if we had asked this question 6 months ago, 3 months ago, now, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, the answers will constantly change because we're learning how to deal with things, we're experiencing things for a longer period of time and figuring out what we can do. So again, this is very much a point-in-time question, and it could certainly be different 3 months from now, and it could have been different 3 months ago.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. So I'm going to move to the second to the last agenda item, why managed services will play a greater role as organizations move forward. And I'm going to turn this over to Dennis.
Yeah, thanks, Joni. So one question that will typically come up is, what size organization or what size lease portfolio does managed service make sense for? And it really is for any size because the reasons, some cases are very unique to the size of the organization, but there are also some things that are common themes across all organizations. One that I think I'd mention, it's mentioned in mid-size, but it certainly applies to all, and it's thinking about maintaining the focus on value-add functions. One way that I think about this is in regards to employee happiness and retention. I mean, if you can limit the amount of transactional work that you're giving them people and giving them more of a chance to do analytical work, it not only helps the organization, but it helps them as well. A lot of people think of a transactional job as a transitional job. They want to get out of it and do something else as quick as possible. So having that managed service provider that can do the transactional work for you helps keep your people happier. And another thing about why their organizations are looking to manage services, like I mentioned earlier, you're looking at a project in your near future to determine what you're going to do for lease accounting under the new standard. Is that project going to involve looking at various softwares, looking at demos and reading up on them and talking with references and talking with other people and internally deciding which software has the most of what you need and which one doesn't have what you need? Or do you want to look at a managed service provider? And like I said, there's two things to consider. What do I need to get them and how is it done? Is it done in a very automated manner or is it done manually, in which case you'll have to have controls in place? And what am I going to get back? What am I getting back on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, on a yearly basis that helps me do that work and make sure that everything's done? And again, a key is things happen over time. There are going to be events that have to be tracked. There are things that happen on leases. Like I said earlier, about 70% of your lease portfolio undergoes at least one change per year. And it's not just real estate leases with amendments and rent changes and CPI adjustments and things like that. It's equipment changes where things move, things are lost or stolen. There's early buyouts. There's different things like that. There's impairments. There's end of term to think about for every lease that's coming up to end of term. Do you have a process and a controls in place to make sure you're doing all of the appropriate things in the appropriate time so that the end of lease is a very, very controlled process? Or do you have leases where you've got a piece of equipment in a facility that had a 3-year lease, but the facility managers thought you owned it. It's still there. Your AP is still paying on a monthly basis, and they're still thinking it's your asset. And in fact, you've gone past the end of lease, and the whole reason for leasing is gone out the window. You lease because you control the asset for a managed period of time, for a managed cost, and then you get to move on. If you don't have the controls in place, those things can sometimes fall by the wayside. Tim, any thoughts on this before we move on?
No, I think you hit it right on the head there at the end. For me, it's always about building a business case internally, and where is the ROI, and obviously not having to spend the money on the software and the resources is a big component of this. But when you talk about some of the additional areas of expertise that you can garner from a managed service provider that go over and above just the performance of the compliance aspect, that being, making sure that we have proper end-of-term management, maybe even doing some strategic sourcing on the front end, bringing best practices to bear. If we see another healthcare organization is using a particular vendor and getting a good cost for it, we may be able to share some information on that as far as trying to get better leasing activity for the organizations we support. So at the end of the day, it's about ROI and where you can achieve it the most. I think managing this internally, obviously there's a cost associated with it, and typically what we see for most organizations that implement internally is that they're not leveraging this as an ROI opportunity. They're looking at this as purely a compliance. We've got to spend the money because the FASB or GASB tells us we need to. When you take that compliance aspect and you get beyond that, there's a significant amount of ROI that can be tapped into. And that, if you manage this internally, you just may not have the capability to do so. So that expertise goes over and above just the accounting, but also provides you access to, other areas of ROI that maybe you wouldn't necessarily get if you were deployed internally.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move to our final polling question. Do you think you will consider leasing as a managed service offering? Obviously, yes, no, or unsure at this time. So our final agenda item is who should be included in the analysis of a leasing solution. And I'm going to turn that back over to Dennis.
Sure, thanks, Joni. And again, this is, Tim mentioned earlier, all of the people that are involved in the leasing process. So this is all the people that should be involved in the decision-making process as well, whether you're looking at a software selection or you're looking at a managed service provider, because some of these people will be the people providing that information to the managed service provider if that's the way you go. And it flows through the life cycle of the lease, anywhere from the users of the system or the people that will be getting the results to at the beginning of leases. There's legal and logistics that are involved in the contract negotiations and logistics involved in areas as well. There's accounting and finance on the monthly and the quarterly basis. And then there's operations, because many of these leases, like Tim mentioned, people will generally have a pretty good process in place for real estate. You'll have people managing your real estate. Equipment is sometimes very different. Equipment leases are there. They're everywhere. Sometimes there's a lack of control over who can enter into new leases, so new leases pop up all the time. So part of this is obviously talking about who's going to be involved in the process, but part of this is also involved in how's the process going to be improved down the road, because the one thing that we've seen, again, back to the public companies and the lessons learned, is there's a lot more scrutiny around leasing once it goes on the balance sheet. So making sure you have those controls and processes in place is very important. Tim?
No, I think you're right. I mean, in either way that you go, whether it is internally or looking at a managed service provider, I think you are going to touch all of these groups, and they do have a point of interest in the solution, whether it be an internal process that they're going to have to now comply with in order for finance and accounting to actually deliver the financials correctly, or whether it be with a managed service provider and A, giving them information, or B, perhaps leveraging some of the expertise of the managed service provider to give them something they don't have today. Maybe that's end-of-term management solutions for procurement. Maybe it's strategic sourcing on the front end and access to cheaper leasing rates. So all of these people probably are going to be involved either way you go. I think that it's important to involve them early and often, and especially if it is down the managed service path. I think letting these people have a seat at the table to see what they could gather or actually get from a managed service arrangement will even go further in making the business case for the managed service. So if it's just for accounting and finance, maybe managed service is not the way to go. But if you're actually delivering to procurement and legal and operations, they're all getting something out of it, then I think you're building a more cohesive business case internally for a managed service solution.
Okay. Thanks, Tim and Dennis. And we're going to move to the questions now. And we have a few questions in here, so Tim, I'm going to have you answer this first one. What is the number of resource incremental rise that is typical for a company size of X? Do you have any insight that you can share?
Well, if you're thinking about just the ongoing administration, it's usually there's two things that are dependent. Obviously, the complexity of your portfolio, and B, the solution that you choose. There are certain software solutions that are not as automated as others. And so what may be a 1 FTE equivalent for one software may actually only be a half of an FTE equivalent on another software. So I think there's a couple of variables that come into play there. But, it is kind of, at a minimum, on the low end, it's at least a portion of an FTE, if not more. We've had some organizations that have had to build, 3 to 4 man teams to manage the administration. Again, this is typically due to very complex leases with significant modifications on a monthly basis that require a lot of touch points with the software. But, from a hard fast, it is going to be an incremental add to your finance organization. So if you are 100% utilized, then someone is going to go above 100% in having to deal with leasing going forward. To the extent how much above that is, it will depend on both the software and the complexity.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Dennis, I'm going to ask you the next question. I hear organizations talking about using a center of excellence for leasing. How does that differ from using a managed service?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the real difference is a center of excellence is essentially an internal managed service provider. It's a center of excellence is putting together the expertise, the knowledge, the people that can manage a decentralized process. So the Center of Excellence is obviously within your organization. It's your people, and they will be building the processes together to be able to identify where the information that they need to do the lease management and accounting is coming from, and then they'll be the ones managing the process on a monthly, a quarterly, and a yearly basis. The difference between that and the managed service provider is with a managed service provider, the expertise is external. You're simply paying a monthly fee, a monthly cost for this service. The managed service provider is responsible for staffing and training and the adequate knowledge for everybody and for generating the information that all of their managed service customers need. So again, it's really, Center of Excellence is a great idea if you're going to manage it internally. Choosing the right software that has the automation that allows you to do that is very important. And then if you don't want to worry about the training and the expertise and the resources internally, you look to a managed service provider.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question I'm going to give to Tim. What if an organization wants to bring back a managed service back in-house?
Yeah, thanks, Joni. I think, I had mentioned that earlier. I think at the end of the day, just with like most managed services, the data is yours. You own it. And so at any given point at the end of a contract period, if you chose to invest and actually, bring that back in-house and deploy a software, then that data would be yours and it would be potable and loaded into your solution as desired. So I think the key component there is that anything that is being derived from the managed service provider as far as data on your behalf, you do own and you do have access to at any point should you choose at a later date to maybe do something internally.
Okay, thank you. So we wanted to share with you that you can sign up for a free virtual workshop. To do that, you contact us at partner@rgphealthcare.com. What you'll gain is more understanding of how the implementation of the new standard will impact your existing policies, procedures, systems, and disclosures related to leases. The key takeaways will learn significant impacts of the new standards, develop a timeline to implement the new standard, design a project plan, technology considerations, obviously a LeaseAccelerator demo, and anticipate implementation challenges. So we have done this for several clients, and they have found it very valuable. Again, you can contact us at partner@rgphealthcare.com if you would like to do a free virtual workshop. And in closing, we have recorded again today's webinar. A link to the replay and the slides will be sent via email to all attendees within 2 to 3 business days. I want to thank our expert presenters from RGP Healthcare and LeaseAccelerator for sharing their invaluable insights today. And I also want to thank all of you who participated for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend. Thank you all again and have a great day.